Hello everyone! This is the second part of the tutorial in which we create a shader for simulating old film projection in Godot 4. You can find a link to the first part in the description of this video. We left off in the previous video at this point, and this time we'll complete the entire effect by enhancing it with various scratches, stains, and other types of damage that can appear on film strips. So let's get started. If you watched the previous video, your shader should now be in the same state as the one I have here in front of me. If not, and you want to save yourself the trouble of rewriting everything from the screen, you can find the complete shader along with a huge number of other effects in the Godot Shader Pack product, which I also linked to in the video description. Okay, so we can continue. As I mentioned in the previous video, we are dividing the code into separate functions to make it cleaner and easier to extend. And again, it will probably be a good idea to temporarily disable effects that are too strong and could be distracting while we work. So I'll comment out the calls, scrolling down to the fragment function, calls to add shake, okay, add flicker, and add scan. Only the sepia remains. Cool. So the next effect concerns the simulation of grainy film strips. Unlike previous implementations based on animated chaos, this time we will simulate slightly more coherent structures. So first, we'll add parameters controlling the amount and size of these structures. So I'm scrolling up to the parameter section and adding the parameters uniform float, grain amount with a hint range, and the initial amount is 0.35 and the range goes from 0 to 1 with the step 0.01, and the second one uniform float grain size with another hint range and the initial size 1.2, and this time it goes from 0.5 to 4 with the step 0.01. Okay, and now I will write the add grain function, which will once again have one new parameter. So let's expand this window. I will find the last one, add scan, and after that, let's add this void, add grain, and parameters in out, vec4 color, vec2 UV, float time, and now vec2 resolution. Okay. So as you can see, we are using the image resolution to achieve the same stripe size under all circumstances. And now we perform the actual calculation, where we again adapt to somewhat shaky changes occurring 16 times per second. So the code will look like this. Vec2, let's call it grain UV because we are supposed to recalculate it using the resolution vector. Floor of resolution times UV divided by grain size and divided by resolution. Okay, and now frame seed. Float frame seed equals floor of time times 16. Again, we are doing something 16 times per second to simulate the irregularities of an old projector. All right, and let's define the grain. Float grain equals hash 1, 2 this time because we are working with a vector grain UV plus frame seed, and I think the value is pretty high, so let's divide it by 1000, multiplying by 0.001. Okay, and finally we can change the color. So color.rgb is increased by grain minus 0.5 times grain amount. Okay, that should be everything. So all that remains is to call this function addGrain from the fragment function. So scrolling down, and after the commented out addScan, let's add it. And I think I will show the 2D editor so we can see the result immediately. And let's add it here, addGrain with parameters color, UV, time, and resolution. Okay, yeah, and something is here. And that something is not correct because I made a typo. So please go back to the add grain function. And here in this line, float grain equals hash to 1. Grain UV is not supposed to be times this, but plus. Change it to plus. And now this is exactly what I expected. This kind of structure is something that definitely better simulates the issues on the surface of the old film. Okay, great. And occasionally some slightly strange artifacts may appear, but I think that once we have all shader components enabled, nobody will notice any anomalies. Okay, so now we get to probably the most distinctive layer, namely the vertical cracks and scratches that appear in old films as a result of the film strip moving through the projector. So we'll control them using 4 parameters altogether. First, we'll define the number of simultaneously active scratches. But before I do that, I think this is also a good candidate to temporarily disable so it doesn't just interfere with more effects while we are designing them. Okay, and now I'm scrolling up to the uniform parameters section and adding the mentioned parameters. So uniform float scratch count with a hint range and the initial value. I think that 3 simultaneously active scratches were good enough. Okay, and the range goes from 0 to, let's say, 10, and the step is of course 1. Okay, now we need the speed at which they change their position. So the second parameter, uniform float scratch speed with hint range, and the initial speed I think I set to 1.8, and the range goes from 0 to 5 with a step point 0.01. Then we want to know the width of such a scratch. Uniform float scratch width with another hint range and the initial value 0.2, and the range goes from 0 to 1 with the step 0.01. And finally, the brightness, which will fluctuate somewhat randomly, so they do not look all the same. I mean the scratches. So uniform float scratch bright with a hint range and the brightness 1.4, and the range goes from 0 to 2 with the step point 0.1. Okay, and now we arrive at the add scratches function, which will belong to the more complicated one. So first I'll write its basic structure. Scrolling down after the add grain and before fragment, let's add it here. Void add scratches with parameters inout, vec4, color, vec2, UV, and float time. Okay, and now the implementation. This time I probably will not describe every single line and will only briefly say that we will add slightly wavy vertical lines into the image at random positions and with random lifetimes. We will generate them using the smooth step function and limit their length using the step function. And of course, we will see plenty of randomly chosen constants and calls to the hash11 function. So I'm going to start coding now and occasionally mumble some commentary. Okay, and since it's supposed to be a longer code, it definitely deserves a bigger window to code in. So I expanded that and now I'm going to write it. So let's start with a cycle, which is equivalent to the number of scratches we want to display at the same time for float I from 0 to the parameter scratch count I++. Okay. And now each scratch will live for a short random duration and then it will jump to a new position. So let's define this time float sc to make it shorter. Time equals floor of time times scratch speed, and to change it for the indices plus I times, let's say, 3.7. Okay, now we need the x coordinate randomly chosen, so as float scx would be hash11 with parameter sc time times 0.1 just to divide by 10 and plus some other value I times 1.3 and plus 0.7 to give it more a bigger pseudo-random factor. And sometimes we want this line to disappear so it blinks and better simulates that scratch exists only on certain fields and not everywhere. So float, let's call it scexist, equals step function. This is a good function for that because it returns 0 or 1 depending on the edge value, and so 0.45 and now hash11 sc time times 0.2 plus I times 2. Okay, and everything is multiplied by 0.8. All right. And finally, we need to define the brightness. So float sc bright equals 0.6 plus hash11 sc time times 0.2 plus I times 2. And I think this should not be here. So in the line sc exists, let's change them. I think it doesn't matter too much, but let's do it exactly just like I did it before during my initial experiments. So this time we're multiplying by 7. Okay. Okay, and the multiplication by 0.8, it's supposed to be down here. All right. And now the scratch itself. It could be a vertical line, but I think it might look a bit better if we make it just a little bit wavy. So we'll use the sine function to change the shape. Float sc wave equals sine of uv dot y times 30 plus sc time. So it fluctuates a little bit. And because we don't want to make it too wavy, let's multiply by a small number like 0.002. Okay. And now we need to draw a line. And as we already used in some previous videos, we usually do that by calculating a distance using the absolute value and then calculating the shape using the smooth step function, like this. Float dist equals abs of uvx minus scx and plus sc wave to give it a wavy shape. And now the line itself, so float sc line equals smooth step of scratch width times 0.01, again dividing by 100 because it's supposed to be very, very thin, and the second edge is 0, and finally the value is dist. Okay, this should be correct, and the scratch should also fade and random y segment so it doesn't stretch infinitely in a vertical direction. So float y mask equals the step function of #11 sc time plus I plus I said plus 0.1. Okay, and the second argument is uv dot y. All right, and let's multiply that by another step and put it to the second line so it's better readable. Times step uv dot y #11 again sc time plus I plus 0.2, okay, and plus 0.5. All right, and now we can finally add this to the color of the pixel. So color.rgb is increased by a C line times a C exist times a C bright times scratch bright parameter and multiplied by the y mask. Okay, and this is not everything. We also want to give it a slightly darker shade, so let's multiply this by vec3 1.97 and 0.88, so it's not entirely white. Okay, so the function is finished, and all that remains is to add its call into the fragment function. Let's scroll down, and after the commented out add grain, let's add scratches with parameters color, UV, and time. Okay, and let's take a look. Yeah, we can definitely see them there, but it seems I made another typo somewhere because they are definitely not too wavy, or maybe they are too wavy. So give me just some time, I will find it. Okay, I found it, and again, it's something that I should have used plus instead of multiplication. So please find the line in the add scratches function starting float sc wave and sine of uv dot y times 30 and plus sc time, not times. And now it is correct. Yeah, I think this is what I wanted to achieve, and it definitely looks more like scratches or cracks. Okay, so anyway, if we dislike something about the waves, we have about lines, we have 4 parameters in the inspector to change many things about them, so we can adjust the final appearance. Okay, next come the stains, which will probably be more visible if we temporarily disable the scratches too. So let's scroll down to the fragment function and comment out this line. Okay, now we are ready. So this time we will manage with just a single uniform parameter, which will control the amount of stains in the interval from 0 to 1, which corresponds to probability expressed in percentages. So let's scroll up to the uniform parameters section again, and I will add this one parameter, uniform float, dust amount with a hint range and 0.3. Let's start with that. The range goes from 0 to 1 with the step point 0, 1. Okay, and we will add the basic structure of the add blobs function, let's call it like that. This time we do not need to know the resolution because the stains and dust particles will look irregular and any distortion does not matter. So I'm scrolling down just before the fragment function and adding this new one. Void add blobs with parameters inout, vec4 color, vec2 UV, V, and float time, the usual stuff. Okay, and as for the algorithm itself, we will combine dark stains and bright dust particles that often appear on film. Once again, we will use various constants and fragment calls to the #11 function. So let's expand the window. And again, I will just write the code and sometimes I will add a short explanation. Well, very well, so let's start it. Float dust time equals floor of time times 4 this time to define some frequency of appearing new particles. Okay, and now we need some random factor to find out whether or not we want to add this to give it some more irregular behavior. Dust RNG for random generator is simply #11 of dust time, and I think we can multiply it by 0.03 and add 11.1 just to change the random factor. Okay, and now if dust RNG is less than dust amount, our parameter, in this case, let's add it. So vec2 blob pos, the random position we will define here, and is vec2, and again I will separate its components to separate lines, and the first one is #11 of again dust time. This time let's multiply it by 0.1 and add 3, and the second line will be just the same with different parameters. So #11 dust time times 0.3 plus 7. Okay, now we need to define the shape. So let's start with the blob radius. Float blob radius is 0.003, just to make sure that it is never equal to 0, plus #11 of dust time times 0.1, and let's multiply it everything by 0.01, so it's not too huge. Now we need to calculate the distance from the current pixel, so it would be using the length function. Float blob dist is simply length of UV minus blob pos. Okay, and let's define the blob itself. So float blob is again the smooth step function with the edges blob radius, then blob radius times 0.4, and the value is our blob distance. Okay, and now we want to distinguish between dark spots and something like bright hair particles. So let's define the variable float is bright where we simply again use the step function to distinguish between two situations. The edge is 0.5 and now the argument #1. 1 applied on dust time times, let's say, 0.5, and let's add 1. Okay, and we can finally change the color. And this time we will use two mixes nested, because first we need to distinguish between the dark and light, and then we want to mix the original color and and the blob. So it equals, this time equals, not plus equals, but only equals, and mix of color RGB, our original color. Then let's put it to the second line. Another mix. Now we mix the dark and light. So first the dark color, it would be VEC3 and something like 0.05 for red, 0.03 for green, and 0.02 for blue. This is the first one. The second one would be VEC3. This is light, so 1.95 and 0.8, values close to the white color. And finally, the weight factor is simply our is bright value. Okay, and finally we need to add the weight factor for our outside main mix, which is the blob function, blob variable. Okay, and finally we will add the call to the new function, this one, add blobs to the fragment function. Let's do it here. Add the blobs with parameters color, UV, and time. Okay, and let's take a look how many issues we will find this time. Okay, it seems there is nothing. Oh, there are something. Can you see them? I think it will be better visible if I just go to the inspector and increase the dust amount to the maximum. Now we should see a lot more of them appearing and disappearing. So yes, I would say this one works as expected at the first try. Perfect. By the way, our parameter list has become quite long, hasn't it? We are almost at the end. Two effects remain, and the first one is practically the same as what we did for the old photograph simulation. It is the black border or vignette. In the case of film, we will randomly change its radius so that it looks more dynamic, and for that we will add two parameters. And I think that this time we don't need to comment out the current effect because it's not too prominent and definitely doesn't interfere. So I'm scrolling up to the uniform parameter section and adding the mentioned parameters. Uniform float, vignette strength, with a hint range and the initial value 0.85, and it goes from 0 to, let's say, 2 with the parameter with the step 0.01, and the second one we'll call vignette pulse because it will be responsible for pulsing, periodic changing of the vignette radius. So a uniform float vignette pulse with another hint range and initial value 0.25, and this parameter goes from 0 to 1 with a step 0.01. Okay, and now the function itself, which consists of setting up an ellipse-shaped mask with blurred edges that will pulse, thus simulating imperfections of the projector lamp, whose brightness changed according to fluctuations in the electrical grid. In addition, the film strip itself was somewhat bent, which also contributed to the rounded edges of the final image. So the function looks like this. Let's expand the window, scroll down just before the fragment function right here, and I will add void add vignette with the usual parameters in out vec4 color, vec2 UV, and float time. All right, and let's start with defining the pulse. So float vig pulse is 1 plus sine time times 1.3 and multiplied by the vignette pulse parameter. So this is periodically changing using the sine function. And now we also need to temporarily move the origin to the center. So let's define something like vig vec2 vig uv, and as we know from previous videos, it's simply uv minus 0.5. Okay, this is the only place when we need to do this shift, otherwise we are working with the original uv coordinates. Okay, and now let's define the distance to the edges of the vignettes. So it would be float vig dist equals length of vig uv coordinates, and because we want an ellipse, let's multiply that by vec2 with parameters 1 and 1.3, for instance. Okay. And now the vignette itself, where we again use the smooth tab function. So float vignette equals smooth tab of with the edges 0.3 and let's say 0.75 to give it some blurry edge, and multiplied by vig pulse. In the value is our vig dist. Okay, and now we can change the color. So color dot RGB is multiplied by 1 minus vignette times vignette strength. Okay, and by the way, we don't want the vignette to be purely black because it doesn't look too natural, so I will just add a mix with some brownish tint. Let's do it here. Color RGB equals, just equals this time, because we are using the mix function of color RGB, vec3 0.05, 0.03, and 0.01. This is just the color close to black, but not entirely black. And the value is vignette and times vignette strength, and let's multiply it by 0.4. Okay, and now let's go to the fragment function where we add the corresponding core. Right here, after add blobs, add vignette, color, UV, time, the usual parameters. Okay, and let's take a look. Yeah, definitely it is here, the ellipse, and it's pulsing, it's changing its radius, and I would say it looks pretty cool. All right, so this completes the vignette, and the number of parameters has increased to 24. The last one, the 25th, will control the probability that a burnt or almost burnt through frame appears on the film strip, causing a short bright flash in the form of a horizontal band. So let's add this as a parameter. Scrolling up and adding the last parameter, uniform float burn chance with a hint range, and let's give it a very small chance, so 0.02, and it goes from 0 to 1 with the step point 0.1. Okay, And the last function, called addBurn, will be similar to addScan function, because once again we will create our horizontal stripe with blurred edges. However, it will not move and will display it only for a very short moment, like this. Expanding the window again, and let's find the fragment function, and before that I will add addBurn, void addBurn inout vec4 color, vec2 UV, and float time. Okay. And first, let's define float. Burn seed equals floor of time times 8. Okay, this is the basis for other pseudo-random calculations, which starts with a variable called burn RNG. Just like before in the spots, it will define the probability that the flash will appear, and then we'll also calculate its position, of course. So equals #11 of burn seed times 0.01 and plus 13 this time. Okay. Now we want to determine whether the flash appears or not, again with the step function, so float. Burn flash equals step of 1 minus burn chance and burn RNG is the value. Okay, and finally we need the position of this flash, so float. Burn pose equals #11 applied on our burn seed times 0.07 plus 2, for instance. Okay, so this is the Y center of the burn stripe, and now let's define the stripe or band, so float burn band equals, and again let's use the exponential with the negative parameter to create some nice blurred edges. Negative power of uv dot y minus burn pose, okay, multiplied by 6, and the second argument is 2. Okay, yeah, this should be correct, and we can finally change the color. So color.rgb is increased by plus equals burn flash times burn band times 0.9 and multiplied by another color close to white, so like 3 of 1.97 and 0.85. Okay, and that should be everything. So now, when I now add the function call to the fragment function, we'll be able to observe the flashes, hopefully. So add burn, add burn color UV and time. Okay, and let's save and take a look and hope for the best. Nothing so far. Ah, here it is. Looks like it works very nice. And I think when I change the probability, the burn chance, it will burn, it will flash up really very often, which is definitely what we don't want. So let's get back to 0.02 and it should be fine. Okay, so we are almost done. All that remains is to clamp the resulting pixel here in the fragment function into the expected range. However, because some effects can be slightly brighter, let's allow a small amount of overexposure this time. So we will clamp it to not to 0 to 1, but 0 to 1.5. like this: color.rgb equals clamp of color.rgb, and the edge is 0, and as I said, 1.5. Okay, and now we have really everything. I will now uncomment the lines that I commented out earlier so that we can enjoy the final effect with all details enabled. Let's do it. Add scratches, add grain, add skin, add flicker, and add shake. Here we go. Everything is here and everything seems to be working. Perfect. Thank you very much for watching. I think the effect would stand out even more if we used animation or a playing video instead of a static image. This shader is also a very good candidate for a full-screen post-processing effect, which could bring our game to life in a very interesting way. And of course, we can modify it using 25 parameters, which I did not do this time because the video would probably become far too long. And once again, I remind you that you can find the complete shader in the Godot Shader Pack product, which I link to in the video description. For now, take care, good luck with your game projects, and I will see you in the next video.